Welcome everyone to our training on Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. This is a 4-part training series covering the upgrade from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. My name is Brian Nice. I am a Principal Program Manager within our Teams Engineering, Customer, and Partner team. Before we dive in, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Some additional resources include additional modules that can be found at aka.ms/Teams Academy. Additionally, we're looking for 2 types of feedback. For feedback on this session, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Community, create a new post, and add the IT Pro training tag. This will allow us to easily find your feedback for this session. If you're looking to provide feedback for various features of the Teams product itself, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Feedback. Keep in mind that Teams and Office 365 evolve constantly, so you should stay up to date on our blog at aka.ms/Teams blog. The slide also indicates the current version of this presentation. You are currently in Part 2, Planning the Paths to Teams. In this training, we'll be covering the Planning the Path to Teams agenda item. The previous agenda items were covered in our prior training, and the remaining 2 will be covered in subsequent trainings. Some key learnings for this particular training. Teams itself is much more than just a simple technical migration. There is a people change aspect that cannot be overlooked as part of the upgrade process. When we begin our planning, we should always start with a proven framework. The side-by-side approach is preferred, and in this instance, user adoption is super critical to be successful in this path. There are additional approaches that are available for complex scenarios, and we will detail these as we go throughout this training. So let's take a look at the various paths to Teams. We begin by planning our upgrade process. We need to ensure that we always start with a proven framework. And what we've built out here, as you can see evidenced by the URL at the bottom of this page, is an end-to-end process that can help enable customers and partners to plan, coexist, prepare users, and perform the upgrade when ready. This includes starting with our set of project stakeholders, moving through our project definition, building out our technical readiness and our user readiness capabilities, implementing our deployment and pilots and coexistence strategies, and finally building out our operational excellence to have our sustained operations and user adoption. So let's break these down in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. First, our project stakeholders. Do we have the right ones? I mean, obviously it's good to have stakeholders, but are they the right stakeholders? We need executive sponsors. Do we have the corresponding IT pros that we need in the discussions? Our user adoption and change managers, are they present and available? Have we identified a project lead? Have we identified a quality champion? These are all key roles that we see that we build out as part of our project team that can help us set the stage for the overall upgrade to Microsoft Teams. As a tip, define your roles and accountabilities as well as the various checkpoints that you need to make sure that your team stays very aligned throughout this entire process. Now we need to define our project. We need to consider what is the vision, what is the scope for the project. We're looking at digital transformation as an example, and changing the way our folks work on a daily basis. Well, let's understand what that full vision is and what that scope of that project is. Then you can lay out what your milestones are, determine what your end goals are, and most importantly, how you are going to measure whether this was successful or not. As part of the definition, we need to ensure that we set a baseline so that we know where our current state is. And as part of that current state, we assess where we are with our current state of a Teams deployment. Maybe we haven't even started yet. Or perhaps as we're building this project, we're maybe part of the way through our team's deployment. Maybe we have a pilot running already. So we want to make sure that we assess the current state of our team's deployment and adoption. Then we can determine what the ideal path would be from the Skype for Business world to Teams. How are we going to handle coexistence? What is our timeline going to be? And so forth. We will cover those in greater detail as we go throughout the relevant trainings. As a tip, utilize SMART goals and implement a risk mitigation plan. This ensures that we keep our project on track. Technical readiness. This is the part that a lot of folks like to jump right towards, but realize where we are in this process, right? This is the third piece of the puzzle that we're looking at here. Readying our environment for teams. Do the IT staff have what they need? Whether that's tool sets, whether that's training and knowledge or what have you, do they have what they need to manage this migration? Does your environment technically meet the requirements for Teams, right? Do we have SharePoint in place, SharePoint Online in place? Do we have Exchange? Where do we sit with OneDrive for Business, the various components that Teams utilizes, right? Where is our Azure Active Directory or our synchronization happening, right? How do we prepare the network? Is it ready for real-time communications? How are we going to ensure that we have proper quality for that particular network? How do we handle our endpoints, whether they're headsets? Are they certified headsets? Are they certified devices? And so forth. And how are we going to configure Teams for our users? Right? What aspects of Teams are we going to enable from the end user perspective to ensure that we have the right technical components available? Quality of experience is, of course, critical in driving the users to Teams. Teams in and of itself is very similar to Skype for Business in the sense that it's what we commonly refer to as the, quote, canary in the coal mine, unquote, which means that if there's an underlying challenge with your network or something of that nature, Teams will probably find it and Teams will probably get blamed for it. So as a result, we want to ensure that we have a good quality of experience to ensure that our users are happy with utilizing Teams. As such, we should enlist a quality champion to help ensure that our network not only starts out in, but remains in a healthy state. On top of the technical aspects, of course, we can't forget to ready the organization, that is, the users themselves. We have to look at the broad scope of projects that may be running in parallel at the moment so that we can understand first and foremost how many other changes are currently planned. Generally not a good idea to hit users with tons of changes all at the same time. What does the change culture look like for your organization? Do we have a predominant set of laggards that are slow to adopt? Do we have a predominant set of innovators that are very quick to adopt change? Do we hit across the board and have a little bit of everything, right? What is the predominant change culture that we use? Who are those key personas that we're going to work with? And what are the scenarios that teams can provide from a teamwork perspective that will give the most, what we call bang for the buck, right? What's the most benefit that we can get for readying our organization and utilizing Teams? Most critical, what is the value for the user to adopt Teams, right? What's in it for me? Users have to understand a reasoning for change to be able to embrace it. What are you going to use as your communication mechanisms, your training, your support channels, right? How do you leverage that? Do you have a mechanism in place for that today? Do you have a partner that you work with for this? Do you have in-house training expertise? How are you going to build out that particular regimen that we need? And how are you going to build out your champions program to ensure that you have that support that's driven by peers that are utilizing the platform? Remember that people aren't going to just automatically change, and they're also not going to be a one-size-fits-all type approach. We need to ensure that we take our time and assess our user propensity for change. That will then allow us to build a proper readiness program to meet the end user's needs, which will in turn result in them developing a more deep habitual usage of this particular platform. Step is to implement our upgrade plan. This is where we determine the components for our pilot So we understand who those participants are, what the pilot timeline is, the various test plan components that we need, and of course the end goals of that pilot. From there, we can define our go and no-go decision points to determine, based on the results of our pilot, if we're going to proceed into the next phase of the upgrade strategy. Once we then transition to that next stage of the upgrade strategy, we need to determine how many users are we going to migrate. Are we going to, say, for example, finish our pilot and then simply migrate the rest of the company all at once? Or are we going to do them in a cycle where we have batches of users that are being migrated over a period of time? How do we monitor and iterate as we go? Because as we hit various persona types and so forth, we may learn some new things that require us to adapt and tweak and change the upgrade strategy as we go. The formal pilot itself helps you to validate that particular plan that you've built on a much smaller scale. That's a lot more manageable than trying to validate your plan across a 10,000 seat deployment. Now, it is critically important when we build the pilot that we have a great cross-representation of our users. We don't just want to grab IT, because that's not a great representation of our end user population. So we should have a good representation of various personas, including some power users in the Skype for Business world, so that we can understand where they may identify challenges moving forward into teams. And don't forget, you probably want to get some of the laggards too, because again, we want to understand how we're going to need to adapt and iterate our upgrade strategy as we move throughout this deployment. Lastly, we move into our operate and amplify teams adoption step. Some considerations here. What are we going to measure our success against? What are our goals that we're working towards? How do we mitigate? How do we iterate? How do we ensure that this particular deployment is successful? How do you manage the operations on a day-to-day basis, right? What are the pieces that we're going to be looking towards? What are tool sets that we're going to be able to use? What is our plan for monitoring quality within the environment? How do we maintain the momentum to grow adoption for teams, to ensure that our users are really transforming the way that they work rather than trying something out for a day or two and then just kind of putting it back in the drawer? And then how do we optimize the teamwork strategy overall? Again, Teams is much more than just simply a replacement for Skype for Business where we do chat, calling, and meetings. It's an evolution of how we do teamwork. So how do we optimize that strategy? How do we optimize that digital transformation that we do as an organization? Of course, initial excitement can wane, right? The novelty of it wears off, as we call it. We want to be able to sustain our results with an operational plan that helps by including network and quality checks, user adoption excitement, product innovation deployment, right? Help the users to understand that it's not just a simple once and done, but that we are continuing to evolve the platform and continuing to innovate in ways that can help them in their daily routine. You can get to Teams from Skype for Business. Navigating the journey is not as difficult as it may seem. It's all about mapping your upgrade journey. Just like any destination, there's multiple ways to get to Teams. If I'm going to go on a vacation, there's multiple ways that I can get to my vacation destination as well. In the case of going to Teams from Skype for Business, well, your organization may opt to go directly from Skype for Business straight into what we call Teams only mode, right? You may just simply deploy Teams, flip everybody to Teams only, and away we go. Or you may choose to run Skype for Business and Teams together for a particular period of time with selected modalities and so forth. So as we talk about defining that path from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams, there's a couple of different ways that we can approach it. Let's start with our first option here, which talks about upgrading from Skype for Business using our default recommended path. Now, the first path that we're going to look at is known as the full side-by-side approach. And we're going to look at this from the user perspective. In fact, we're going to put this into a bit of a scenario for us. So let's imagine that we have a customer that is utilizing Skype for Business online today. We'll take a pretty straightforward, simple example first. So the environment is utilizing Skype for Business online. They are utilizing the chat functionality. They are scheduling meetings in Skype, and they are also using the calling functionality. Now, this could also include phone system with calling plans, for example, but they are heavily utilizing the Skype for Business application. The intent of the full side-by-side approach is, in addition to the current experience that the user has in Skype for Business, we will also introduce the Teams application with what we call full, with a little asterisk, full functionality. Essentially, what we mean here is we're exposing all of the various modalities that the Teams application can provide. This includes chat. This includes scheduling of Teams meetings. This also includes calling. Specifically here, this is VoIP calling and the collaboration aspects of Teams. So the intent here is to allow the users to experience some of the benefits of the Teams digital transformation as quickly as possible, while still being able to leverage their Skype for Business application. Now, a key piece with this full side-by-side approach is that all users must run both the Skype for Business client and the Teams client at all times until we've completed the migration or completed the upgrade. This is critical because in this full side-by-side approach, there is no interoperability available, meaning the Skype application is not aware of the Teams application and the Teams application is not aware of the Skype application. So there isn't any way for these applications to communicate between each other. So Teams communications will stay within Teams and Skype communications will stay within Skype. Now, as we get the full side-by-side approach in full deployment mode, we want to ensure that we've deployed the Teams application to all of our end users as rapidly as possible, and that we've leveraged our adoption and change management strategies to ensure that our users are starting to now begin to develop that habitual usage of the Teams application. As we take this full side-by-side approach, the intent then is, as users become more and more familiar with utilizing Teams, when the day comes for us to be able to flip the switch to Teams, they've already developed this habitual usage of the Teams application, and thus the move from Skype to Teams ideally becomes a non-event because the users have now started to develop that usage of the Teams application itself. The intent, of course, with this approach is to ensure that we can rapidly saturate adoption of the Teams application throughout the organization, and then move the organization from Skype for Business to Teams as quickly as possible. Now let's take a look at this full side-by-side approach from the organization's perspective. So again, that scenario that we looked at previously, I have an environment with a Skype for Business online deployment. Again, we'll say that this customer is utilizing all of the various features of Skype for Business, including chat, meeting scheduling, calling, phone system, and so forth. As we go about this full side-by-side approach, we deploy the Teams application side-by-side with Skype for Business. Now, again, this could be online or on premises, but we'll focus on the simplistic Skype for Business online environment first. And the key here with this full side-by-side approach is to ensure that we have this saturation of deployment of the Teams application side-by-side with Skype for Business. This rapid adoption, this saturation while users are still using Skype, allows us to get users comfortable and familiar with the new features that Teams provides, as well as being able to do some of the common features that they're used to in Skype for Business in the Teams application. But it doesn't take away that crutch, if you will, or that capability for them to use the Skype for Business application while they're learning Teams. Once we've reached an appropriate saturation level of adoption, and if we're utilizing any room devices, conference room devices in our environment, and we ensure that those devices are Teams ready, And by Teams ready, we mean they could be Teams room systems, or what we call MTRs, Microsoft Teams rooms, or they could be third-party devices that use our cloud video interop. But we've basically accounted for our meeting rooms being able to join Teams meetings. At that point, we are now ready to begin upgrading our users to Teams only. And again, with this full side-by-side approach, we want to ensure that we upgrade as rapidly as possible. Now, there are some critical success factors that we need to be aware of when we look at this full side-by-side approach. First and foremost, success is really dependent on the adoption and change management strategy of your organization. It's not solely dependent on size of the organization, right? This could be an organization of 1,000 folks. This could be an organization of 10,000 folks. The key here for this approach is hinging on adoption and change management, because it's user adoption, not the IT action, that is going to govern this overall timeline. The quicker that we can saturate the Teams application into the environment, the quicker that we can get users adopting and developing habitual usage of Teams, the quicker we can retire Skype for Business. Now, a second piece that we talked about is all of our users must run both clients at all times. That is absolutely critical for success here, because users that are in this full side-by-side approach cannot receive any type of interop, chat, or call from Skype for Business or from Teams. So again, to reiterate, any incoming communication that originated in Teams lands in Teams. If it originated in Skype, it lands in Skype, right? We don't have a mechanism for Teams to talk to Skype or Skype to talk to Teams when the user is in this full side-by-side approach. Users need to be comfortable with these incoming communications landing on either client. It means that they need to know that both applications are running and available, and the user could receive an incoming communication in either place during this transitionary period. If you are tackling the on-premises world, I know the example we gave earlier was to stay simple with the online world, but if you do happen to tackle the on-premises world with this full side-by-side approach, during this full side-by-side period, your users must continue to use Skype for Business for any and all federation. That is communication to folks outside of your organization. If they are on premises, they won't have the capability of being able to do that particular task inside of Teams. Now, if you want some more detail on why that is, you can watch part 3 where we talk about coexistence and interoperability, and we go into much greater detail at that point. The third critical success factor here is to saturate adoption and build a full readiness plan prior to upgrading anybody in the organization. And again, we reiterate, if you are in Teams only, that is that final end state, you have been upgraded, they can only reach a full side-by-side user in the Teams application, right? Because there's no interop, right? That Teams only user can't reach the person in Skype because there's no interop. We have to reach them on Teams, which means if you don't have that deployment done of the Teams application, you don't have the adoption there, you may strand some of your users where they're not able to communicate properly, right? So that means we need to wait to start upgrading users to Teams only until we hit that saturation level of adoption, right? Take the example of my Skype Online organization. Say I have 1,000 people. I can't deploy the client to 100 people and say, cool, now let's take those 100 people and upgrade them to Teams only, because the other 900 folks that are out there haven't gotten the Teams client yet. So how are the 100 people that are upgraded to Teams supposed to talk to the 900 people that don't have a Teams client yet if we're in this full side-by-side approach? So you have to make sure that you are ready across the board. You have the adoption taken care of. You have the deployment of the client and saturation taken care of. If you have meetings in scope, address your meeting rooms like we talked about earlier. If you have calling or what we used to call enterprise voice or phone system in scope, make sure all of those pieces are accounted for before you begin the upgrade process, because the intent of full side-by-side is that your upgrade period should be a very short period where you're essentially doing a quick transition from the Skype for Business and Teams world together, that full side-by-side world, to the end state, which is Teams only. Now let's talk about how we handle the upgrade for a slightly more complicated organization. There are some exceptional situations for very large or very complex organizations where you may not prefer to use, or you may not need to use, the full side-by-side approach. That's okay. We have an alternative approach that you can use as well. And this approach allows us to have a more deterministic process and timeline. So rather than taking the full side-by-side approach and allowing user adoption and change management to drive the timeline, this particular scenario allows IT to be very deterministic about how we roll out the features and functions of the Teams application. This is something that comes into play with organizations that may be concerned about user confusion, right? Having overlap of features between Skype and Teams, help desk not being able to properly respond to situations where we have this client overlap and confusion from the end users. So this second pathway that we're going to look at here can help alleviate that. Some on-premises organizations have regulatory or compliance requirements that are going to force them to keep certain workloads in the on-premises environment. An example of that could be the enterprise voice workload, where perhaps there's a compliance need that requires all calls to be recorded. And we have the capability of doing that in on-premises Skype for Business, but not yet available in Office 365 within Teams. Oftentimes, this particular path comes up with organizations that have very complex or what we call sticky Skype for Business Server enterprise voice deployments. Voice is typically what we term the long pole in the tent, if you will. It's one of the more complex workloads to move from the Skype for Business on-premises world into the cloud. And lastly, the organizations might be involved in some long-term contracts with a hosting provider for Skype for Business Server, which is slowing down their capability of being able to completely move that workload from the on-premises or hosted environment into the cloud. So the pathway that we talk about to work with this scenario is what we call side-by-side with Interop. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it effectively decouples the IT actions for upgrade from adoption saturation and gives the IT admins more control over how the features and functions of Teams are rolled out. Now, keep in mind, if we do take this approach, interoperability is going to be required throughout the upgrade process. So you definitely need to make sure you understand the ramifications of being in a period of interoperability between the Teams application and the Skype for Business application. Now, we've talked about it from the client side in our earlier trainings on this. In part 3 of this training, we go into a much deeper dive on the Interop experience, but at a high level, you need to make sure that you understand the ramifications of Interop between Teams and Skype for Business. Teams, of course, is going to be more attractive when it's more complete, right? Taking features away from the Teams application might make it a little bit less attractive. Side by side with Interop by design starts with a less complete experience because we take certain features like chat and calling and we place them over in or keep them over in Skype for Business. We don't actually light those features up within Teams right away, but we give the IT admin that additional time that they need to bring those more complex workloads over. This particular approach should be used really when it's warranted, right? It's not necessarily an approach that we lead with, especially for organizations that have a very mature adoption and change management strategy, or have the capability and set of users that are able to adopt new applications in a more rapid pace. But it is definitely a tool in the toolbox to help the plan from the more complex or very large organizations to get from Skype for Business to Teams. So let's dig in and look at this side by side with Interop from the user's perspective, much like we did before with the full side by side approach. So again, we'll look at our starting point. And in this case, this could be a starting point of an organization that has a very complex Skype for Business Server 2015 deployment on premises. Maybe they have multiple Skype for Business server pools deployed throughout the globe in multiple geographies. And in this case, my users are leveraging all of the features of Skype for Business Server on premises. So we have chat, we have meeting scheduling, we have calling, which includes enterprise voice. Maybe it includes contact center integrations, right? We've got kind of the whole set of advanced features available in our Skype for Business Server deployment. Now, what's different about this approach is, in addition to leveraging what we have today with Skype for Business, we introduce the Teams application, but one option is for us to introduce the Teams application, but only light up the collaboration features and not the communications capabilities. The communications capabilities being chat, meeting scheduling, and calling. Collaboration, by definition for us inside of Teams, if you're familiar with the Teams interface, you'll know on the left-hand side of the Teams interface, you have your app bar that shows you your activity feed, it shows you the Teams app, it shows you the Files app, and so forth. When we talk about the collaboration features, that's really what we're focused in on, right? The activity feed will be there, the Teams app will be there, which is what gives you access to Teams. It gives you access to the channels inside of Teams, channel chat. You can see files, you can do apps, bots, tabs, extensions. All of those core collaboration features are exposed as part of this collaboration feature set, right? So this particular approach gives the users the opportunity to explore the net new functionality of Teams without the confusion or overlap of chat, meeting scheduling, calling, and enterprise voice, because those features are not enabled in Teams. They are only available inside of Skype for Business. Now, of course, at some period, you would switch all of those communications features over to Microsoft Teams, that being our end state, of course, getting our users into that final state of utilizing Teams for all of the workloads. But if this is a large, complex organization, the likelihood of making that switch for everybody all at the same time is probably pretty nil, right? Pretty much not going to happen. So that means we're going to be taking a more methodical approach to get users into the Teams environment. So if I have an organization that is very global, maybe we've got 20,000 users strong, strewn throughout the globe with these Skype for Business server deployments, I might take a batch of users first in a pilot, maybe 1,000 users, and place them into this Teams only mode. Well, that means that I'm going to have 1,000 users on Teams. I'm going to have 19,000 users on Skype for Business. That means we're going to rely on Interop for those 1,000 users that have been migrated to Teams. We're going to rely on Interop for those guys to be able to talk to the org that has not yet been upgraded. Now let's take a look at what this visually looks like from an organization's perspective. And we're going to start with the first variation, which is nobody's using Teams yet, right? Meaning we have our entire user population on Skype for Business today. Now, in my earlier example, this could be a Skype for Business server on-premises deployment where we have maybe 20,000 users strewn throughout the globe across multiple Skype for Business server pools that are deployed in different geographies. This could also include hybrid, for example, right? Maybe of those 20,000 users, we've got a handful of them that actually were migrated to Skype for Business Online. This same kind of pathway would apply even if you're in that hybrid scenario. But essentially, this is our starting point. Everybody is using Skype for Business, right? We haven't really deployed Teams at this stage. Now we deploy the Teams application to the organization, but we only light up the collaboration features of Teams. Now, of course, adoption change management is going to come into play here because we have to get our users used to using these net new features inside of Teams. So we'll have an adoption work stream that's going to educate our user population on the world of Teams and collaboration and this new workload that we've lit up. But their UC, or Unified Communications workload, remains unchanged. Chat, meeting scheduling, and calling is still living in Skype for Business. Now comes the fun part. Because as I mentioned before, if we have 20,000 users in an organization, we're probably not going to switch 20,000 users overnight from this mode that we see on the left, where we're using Teams for collab and Skype for everything else, to Teams for all, right? And that's typically because if this environment is not only that large, it's going to be that complex. We're going to need to deal with moving meetings. We're going to need to deal with moving the enterprise voice workload. So we're probably going to do this in stages. Well, we begin our Teams pilot. We start with a small subset of users. So if we put this into round numbers, if I have 20,000 users, maybe I start with 1,000 users that are in Teams only mode. Of course, at this stage, there is going to be an adoption work stream that needs to be spun up to make sure that the folks that are here in Teams only mode, as we will define it, right, but are using Teams specifically, they of course have to be trained on how to utilize the Teams application. But we also want to make sure that our adoption workstream accounts for these folks over here, because this scenario that we're in right now is the very first time that we're going to introduce interop or interoperability into the equation, right? Because now I have 1,000 users that are using Teams and I have 19,000 users that are using Skype. Well, the only way the 19,000 users can reach the 1,000 users is sending a message to their Teams application. And the 1,000 users that are over here in Teams, they only have Teams. They can't use their Skype for Business client anymore. So they have to start chats in Teams, but the other 19,000 folks that haven't been upgraded yet are going to receive that message in Skype for Business. Thus, we are going to have an interop scenario. That's why we said earlier, when you look at side by side with Interop, you're going to have to manage this interop experience all the way through the migration. Now, of course, we will likely expand this pilot out as more people are utilizing Teams, less people are utilizing Skype for Business. IT is able to work this through at their pace based on the other extenuating factors that they need to control, such as the meeting room experience or their enterprise voice experience and so forth. But eventually, we will get to the point where we can finally turn Skype for Business off because all of those remaining workloads have been moved over into Microsoft Teams and all of our users have been successfully upgraded. Now, there's a separate variation that we can talk about here with this particular approach of side-by-side with Interop, and it's the scenario where maybe the organization kind of jumped the gun a little bit and started to deploy the Teams application out to users, and maybe it was on purpose, or maybe it was just users found the application and started installing it organically, and now we have a small subset of the population that is actually using Skype for Business and Teams in the full side-by-side mode, right? So, here's our original user population. Everybody's got Skype, but there's this little subset of people that maybe got their hands on the Teams application and are actually using both in this kind of side-by-side, full side-by-side world. Well, in that particular scenario, we can still take the same approach with the user population and give them Teams in this collaboration mode. The one thing that we want to try to resolve very rapidly is to get the users that are here with both applications together over to Teams as quickly as possible, right? Because these folks are kind of in their own little world, kind of on their own little island, you could say, using this full side-by-side approach, whereas the rest of the organization is utilizing this Skype for Business from the UC perspective and Teams from the collaboration perspective. So you'd want to make sure that you get your users into this Teams only pilot as quickly as possible. And then of course, begin to take the rest of the users through this Teams pilot as we saw on the previous slide, right? So being able to get folks moved into Teams as quickly as we possibly can. because again, at this stage, we're going to have some interoperability to deal with. And then of course, we want to have that final migration complete once all of our users have been switched to Teams only mode. Now, there is another approach that we can take, which is a pretty exciting approach for organizations that especially have this high dependency on their complex enterprise voice deployments. And that is to do side by side with Interop, but showcase the meetings workload first. So in this example, same as we saw before, we're starting with our user in Skype for Business with all of that core UC functionality. So they have chat, they have meeting scheduling, they have calling, including enterprise voice available in Skype for Business. And much like we talked about on the previous slide, yes, we could introduce Teams from the collaboration perspective. But sometimes organizations might not be prepared for that collaboration workload just yet. Sometimes compliance gets in the way. Sometimes an organization is on premises today and they haven't deployed the requisite workloads in online to support the collaboration feature set, namely things like Exchange Online or SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business in Office 365. Maybe there's some hiccups around those particular components, so we're maybe not ready to get the entire organization over and leveraging this collaboration workload right out of the gate. So an option you could do here is to introduce Teams, but bring the meetings workload into Teams. Now, to me, this is an exciting approach because the meetings workload is an area that we've made some substantial improvements compared to the Skype for Business world, especially the Skype for Business on-premises world, right? The data that we have, the telemetry that we have in our service shows that the new architecture that we've used to build the Teams application and the Teams infrastructure shows improved call quality, improved meeting join, improved meeting experiences just by the nature of how we've re-architected and redesigned the solution. Now, in this scenario, when we switch the meetings workload out, the cool thing about this is, number one, it's a pretty minor change to the end user, right? Effectively, they see their add-in in Outlook change from a Skype meeting add-in to a Teams meeting add-in. They can then use the Teams application to not only join those meetings, but they could use the Teams application to schedule meetings as well, including our live events feature that we have in Teams. And they get this experience that allows them to see where all of our new innovations are coming from in the meetings workplace. So this is a fantastic way to get users to start adopting this new workload while we deal with that more difficult voice workload on premises, right? So our users get to experience this new meetings functionality. And then of course, our end destination is to take them from this. Now, when their voice workload is ready to go, we bring the voice and the chat workloads along with them. And now they can experience the full bore of the Teams application itself. So if we look at this example, again, from the organization's perspective, we start with our user population here on Skype for Business. Option A could be, like we talked about before, we introduce Skype for Business with Teams, but we don't introduce any of the UC stuff. We just give them collab. I'm really kind of excited about maybe even starting here with our meetings first pilot, where we introduce the ability for the user to start leveraging the meetings workload immediately within Teams. And yes, the collaboration workload comes along with it, but maybe we don't necessarily emphasize it right out of the gate if our organization is not quite ready for it. Or maybe we do if we are ready for it, because it certainly has some extreme advantages from the collab perspective, right? But using this meetings first approach, this gives us that opportunity to start trying out meetings. Now, again, remember with the meetings workload, we're really talking about scheduling meetings here, right? So if I start my pilot, again, if we use round numbers, 20,000 people in the org, maybe I start with 1,000 folks. These 1,000 folks start creating new meetings in Teams. They'll still have their Skype client, so they can join Skype meetings that everybody else in the org is still creating. And if we've deployed the application properly to our end users, The folks that haven't been upgraded yet or are still utilizing Skype for Business will be able to use their Teams application to join the meetings that these 1,000 users are now creating. So it's a great way to start getting folks exposed to the new meetings workload inside of Teams. Of course, we can then try to take the entire org into this meetings first approach, and then stepping stone from there, much like we saw before, we begin with this pilot, a second set of pilots for the Teams only environment. And again, we've got another adoption work stream that comes in here that ensures that our folks understand that at this particular point, this set of users are now in Teams. Everybody else is still in Skype. So much like we said before, there's an interop environment that's happening here and interop threads that are going to be established. So we want to make sure that our adoption and training pick up on that so that not only the people that land here know what they're doing, but the people that are still left in Skype understand what that change of experience is going to be like now that they're talking to some folks that have been upgraded to Teams. As we continue the deployment, we'll get more and more folks on Teams, which in turn causes that meetings first environment to shrink down to the point where we can finally make that completion of the migration to Microsoft Teams. Let's recap the key learnings from this training. Teams is more than a technical migration. There is a people change aspect that is critical to the overall upgrade process. Planning should always start with a proven framework. While doing your upgrade, the side-by-side approach is the preferred approach. However, user adoption is super critical in this path. There are additional approaches available for more complex scenarios, including on-premises migrations from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. Be sure to check out the other trainings that are part of this series of the Skype to Teams upgrade. Thank you for attending this session.